From jaw-dropping royal feasts to mindful spiritual meals, Indian cuisine is like an art gallery of flavors, textures, and stories. They say the next best thing to eating food is savoring the tales behind it. So, here we are. I'm your host Ankita, and you are listening to Beyond Buttered Chicken. Hello. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Today's topic is the very reason why I started this podcast. Curry. Typically associated with Indian cuisine, curry has a much broader narrative. The term curry itself also has been used as an insult. But what exactly is curry? Is it a dish, a spice blend, or something more complex? Let's dive into the fascinating world of curry. Before we immerse ourselves into the details, I highly recommend a few books for those who crave deeper understanding. Curry, A Tale of Cooks and Conquerors by Lizzie Collingham, Taste of Empire, again by Lizzie Collingham, and Curry, A Global History by Colleen Taylor-Sen. Curry is more than just food. It's a narrative of diaspora, of imperial ambitions, and of the magical flavors that have shaped our culinary landscape today. Most curries we recognize today aren't authentically Indian but are a result of cultures migrating in pursuit of better opportunities. When you hear the word curry, you might envision a piece of protein floating in a brownish orange kind of sauce, garnished with a little bit of cilantro, sometimes a little bit of cream. That food is super greasy and it's so hard to digest, and it all just sits there in your stomach. A typical Indian restaurant menu must feature these 5 staples: korma, butter chicken, tikka masala, madras, and vindaloo. Unfortunately, that's often the extent of the offerings under entrees or mains. I mean, come on, for a country with such a rich cultural heritage, reducing it all down to just these 5 is such a shame. These dishes are typically categorized into mild, medium, and spicy. Korma is mild, often made with yogurt and cream. Buttered chicken is also mild, and for some reason it's unnecessarily sweet and has tomato onion base. Tikka masala is a little spicier, like a non-sweetened version of buttered chicken. Madras curry is mediumly spiced with a tomato onion sauce and is often thickened using coconut milk. Vindaloo is supposed to be the spiciest of all, with a brownish onion base with little or no coconut milk. This limited offering has been the norm in most Indian restaurants around the world, including England, USA, Australia, Canada. However, it's not the restaurant's fault really. They serve what sells. What needs to change is the generational misconception about Indian food moving beyond just a handful of curries. Many young, talented, and ambitious chefs and restaurateurs are actually challenging these old stereotypes. There are many new restaurants that are opening in big cities like New York, where the chefs refuse to serve or put the word curry on their menu. I was browsing through a food and wine magazine and I read this line somewhere and I had to make a note of it. This is how it goes. The world's now archaic curry roots paved the way for a new era of Indian restaurants that no longer just serve, air quotes, curry. Let's take a look at curry beyond kormas and buttered chicken and dig a little deeper into the roots of the word curry. The word curry was adopted by the British from Portuguese word caril with a C, and that word came from Kannada or the Malayalam word curry, which is a South Indian term for a meat or a vegetable that is prepared using spices. It's a common dish among the local people. Today, curry in South India refers to a spicy sauce served with meat or vegetables. The Portuguese reconfigured that word to caril with a C, and eventually the British popularized the term curry. Curry became a catch-all term for the diverse dishes Indian cooks prepared for their British officers stationed in India. Whether it was a korma, do piazza, or bharta, British just lumped it all under a single term, curry. When these officers retired and returned to England, they brought these flavors with them, and sometimes even the cooks if they could afford it. Early 18th century cookbooks featured recipes that called for individual spices like coriander, cloves, and cinnamon to be added at different stages of cooking. These authors often claimed that their recipes were authentic and that their sources were the cooks and kitchen helps in India. Indian food cannot be simplified just as curry. The idea of a curry is a concept that Europeans imposed on India's food culture, says Lizzie Collingham in her book Curry. The regional diversity is so vast that the use of similar ingredients can also be different drastically. Therefore, it's crucial to consider the cultural, regional, and historical context when exploring Indian cuisine. It is said that every 150 to 200 kilometers, the cooking style changes. The ingredients might be similar, but their preparation, the serving methods, the use of spices, savoring agents, the types of grains that they are served with, all these things can differ significantly. The diversity is truly astonishing. Before the arrival of Mughals, the people of Hindustan ate food primarily for health and nourishment. Their meals weren't excessively spicy or greasy, and they focused more on healing and the medicinal qualities of the food. Culinary indulgence was not a part of the lifestyle then. Everyday meals consisted of grains, millets, local vegetables, fats like ghee or coconut oil or oil from mustard or sesame seeds, and a few spices. Goat and fish were also consumed depending on the region and religion. The Mughals, however, epitomized indulgence. While the first few Mughal emperors maintained a light, non-extravagant diet and regularly fasted or even followed a simple vegetarian diet on certain days, the later emperors were genuine food enthusiasts. While the people of Hindustan ate to live, the later emperors lived to eat. They were connoisseurs of flavors and took a great delight in any new ingredient, any new cooking method, or even a sweet fruit. Enjoying a variety of sweet, juicy fruits in Persia, they introduced several fruits to India, including melons, apricots, grapes, pomegranates, apples, and pears. Dried fruits were also an integral part of their culinary traditions. In India, they encountered new spices and dairy products. Combining their homeland cuisine, which featured roast kebabs, spit-roasted animals, and stews with dried fruits and tandoor breads, they combine all this with the local ingredients that created a fusion that Indian cooks, or khansamas as they were called, further enriched with their techniques. Dishes such as Rogan Josh, Kalia, Do Pyaza, Pulao, Biryani, Korma, and Kebabs were cooked dum-pukt style using spices but very delicately. A Mughal korma, for instance, is vastly different than what we get in the restaurants today. The meat was first marinated in yogurt and spices, and there was no use of chilies or tomatoes back then. The sauce primarily consisted of browned and pureed onions. The meat was then cooked in fat along with some fragrant spices, creating a rich and delightful sauce. The first Westerners to set foot in India in 1498 AD were the Portuguese, led by Vasco da Gama. By the 1530s, the Portuguese had established a spice trade, though the Mughal emperor still reigned. They had to obtain a firman, which is a royal decree, from the emperor and used various contacts and connections, some ethical and some not, to lay the foundation of Estado da India, the Portuguese trading company. Sir Thomas Roe, an English diplomat working for the King of England, and Edward Terry, who accompanied him to obtain this permission from Emperor Jahangir in 1608, described their experiences in great detail. Terry made special notes about the delicious meals they were served, remarking on the aromatic, soft, fluffy rice and the stewed meat in a sauce. Remember, the term curry was not born yet. By 1615, Sir Thomas Roe was finally successful in obtaining the permissions to trade in Surat, and thus the British East India Company was established. And the rest is history. Many such accounts are available, some online, some in national archives. Authors like Lizzie, Collingham, Colleen Taylorson, and even Madhur Jaffrey have done a marvelous job at making this wealth of information available to us. So as I mentioned, the Mughals cooked meat over charcoal or open fire and prepared it with rice or as a stew. They often used almond paste for thickening and added fruits for an additional flavor and texture dimension. The use of spices was very subtle, yet aromatic and flavorful. When the Mughal Empire began to collapse, Indian cooks from the emperor's kitchens had to start their own shops. This royal cuisine became available to the public through these bawarchis who once cooked for the emperor. Nalli Nahari is one such stew that transitioned from the royal kitchens to the streets of India. As Salma Hussain explains, Nahari means something that is eaten in the morning, like for breakfast. Bony mutton chunks were stewed overnight with spices, onion, and garlic, resulting in this delicious preparation ready for the breakfast. The use of spices was very minimal, ingredients were basic yet fresh, and juicy and luscious meat pieces would simply fall off the bone and melt in your mouth. Today, Nalli Nahari is famously served in Lucknow with tandoor breads, attracting people from all over the world to taste this comforting mutton stew. In the early 18th century, the empire fragmented into smaller presidencies, and the chiefs of these presidencies, who once reported to the emperor, became crowned kings or the Nizams and Nawabs. Thus, several smaller kingdoms emerged. Each of these kingdoms employed local chefs, and the royal Mughal cuisine was again influenced. In the south, tamarind, coconut, and spices were used heavily. Hyderabadi Mughlai cuisine branched off from the original Mughlai food, featuring a heavy use of spices. The spiciest korma, the spiciest nahari, and the spiciest biryanis are all the products of this influence. In the western part of the country, however, particularly Bombay and Goa, there was a significant influence from the Portuguese. In Bombay and Goa, they built churches and Portuguese-style settlements. Missionaries and priests aimed to convert the locals, initially focusing on the lower castes, and later, during the Goa Inquisition, they imposed the religion more forcefully. Portuguese sailors, company men, and officers married locals, exchanging cultural practices, language, and of course culinary techniques, introducing foods of the New World. One thing the Jesuit priests complained about was the bread. Being Portuguese, they enjoyed a variety of breads back home. Soon they learned to make it using coconut toddy for fermentation. Because yeast was not available to ferment bread, that was a big problem. Soon they learned to make it using coconut toddy for fermentation. Similarly, simple stews they carried on ships or on the voyages, preserved with vinegar, took on new forms. Vinegar was replaced by tamarind, which is a savoring agent, and later toddy vinegar was introduced. Spices, including chilies, garlic, coconut, and chunks of meat were added. Voila! Carne de Vinadialos transformed into vindaloo, which became a popular Portuguese curry, air quotes, in Portuguese colonies. Sorpotel, a stew using animal from head to toe and skin to gut, also became a delicacy. Sorpotel comes from Sarapatel in Brazil, where the Portuguese had colonies. The offal of the meat, including blood, was cooked together to make a stew, and hence the name Sorpotel, which means confusion. Portuguese Goa used various meats, beef, pork, lamb, and their influence on that small part of India was profound. Even today, Goans pride themselves on their Portuguese heritage and employ cooking techniques introduced by their forefathers. Soon after the Mughals and the Portuguese left, the British, Dutch, and French arrived to dominate the spice trade. In the struggle for supremacy, the British obviously emerged victorious. Initially, it was the British East India Company that traded goods in the name of the sovereign. However, in 1858, the company was dissolved and India came under the direct rule of the Queen. Queen Victoria was later crowned as the Empress of India. Thus began the era of British Raj, as they called it. British officers, governor generals, and lieutenants were sent to India, some with their families, some alone. Many of them employed Indian cooks and house helps. Muslim cooks, in particular, were adept at preparing most Mughlai dishes, including kormas and do pyazas. When the British officers returned to England, they brought home these recipes to their wives and daughters. Some even brought home the cooks. Indian food thus entered the empire with these retired officials. Additionally, many Indians were brought to England to work at the lifestyle exhibitions of the Victorian Empire. These exhibitions showcased the empire's colonies all across the world. India being one of the main colonies, they had a beautiful exhibition, a beautiful display of what an Indian village would look like, and obviously they had some food to go with it. One of the exhibitionists later went on to establish Veeraswamy's in 1926, which became England's second but longest operating Indian restaurant. The initial cookbooks published in the late 18th century specified the use of individual spices added at specific stages while cooking. However, by 19th century or early 19th century, pre-made curry powder was available for use in England, catering to the busy housewives. Curry, as they called it, became a significant hit in England and was even part of Queen Victoria's royal spread. Based on the three major trading ports, the curry was classified into three categories in most cookbooks: Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. However, the British curry was nothing like what was served in India, and quite naturally so. Many cookbooks and ladies' magazines published what they claimed were authentic recipes for curries would have been prepared by their Indian helps. The British idea of curry involved stewing a protein with onions, garlic, celery, carrots, apples, raisins, coconut, and curry powder. Sometimes Worcestershire sauce was also added. This curry was often thickened with flour. No one in India would recognize this as curry, and there was no question of adding flour as a thickener in India. Most Mughlai dishes used almond paste for thickening, and kormas used a combination of almonds and yogurt, while regional preparations didn't really need thickeners per se. Freshly squeezed coconut milk would suffice. Preparations involving lentils and dals had their own starches that added richness to the dishes. But the British version of curry became so popular that the middle class also started cooking it and serving it at dinner parties. Many brands competed, claiming their curry powder was the most authentic and closest to what a curry should taste like. Things, however, took a U-turn. The next generation of British officials embraced the sophisticated British cuisine with French influences, deeming curry or Indian food unsophisticated. Though still enjoyed in England, British gentlemen in India towards the end of 19th century avoided serving curry or any Indian food at their formal dinners and parties. Curry might have been discreetly served at a luncheon alongside other options, but never as the centerpiece of dinners. The British ladies, or Mem Sahibs as they were called, preferred to instruct their Indian cooks on how to make puddings and souffles, which proved to be a difficult task for the Indian cooks. Unfamiliar with the expected outcomes and unusual cooking techniques, the Indian cooks often produced far different results on the dining table. They had acquired enough skill to make a béarnaise and poached meat dishes, but would often add a hint of their native spices, thinking the requested dishes were too bland. Thus a new style of Indianized French food was born, though it wasn't always the most pleasant tasting fusion. One notable product of this fusion was stew, essentially an English stew, with meat and vegetables cooked in coconut milk and modest use of spices. And just as a bowl of stew would be accompanied by dinner rolls or freshly baked bread, stew today is served with appam, which is a fermented rice crepe. The British categorized curries into three classes named after the major trading ports, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Although they completely ignored the cultural variations and intricacies of Indian cuisine by labeling all Indian food curry, they were astute enough to notice the differences in the ingredients used in the various regional curries. To highlight these variations, the three categories evolved. Madras, being the southern part, was known for its spicy curry made with coconut milk. Calcutta curries often included mustard paste, while Bombay curry was typically a mild brownish curry with onions and garlic. Indian restaurants have evolved over time, but this categorization remains, although the nomenclature has slightly changed. As mentioned earlier, curries are still categorized as mild, medium, and hot, with most of them featuring a tomato and onion-based sauce. Calcutta was one of the main hubs for East India Company, a bustling port where many officers were stationed or laid over before continuing their journey further. They traveled to different towns and cities along the postal route called Dak in native languages. For these officers, Dak bungalows, as they were called, were built around the 1840s, where they could rest during the day to avoid the scorching heat before resuming their journey after sunset. The cooks employed at these bungalows would often prepare a jungle fowl, bred and butchered right there behind the bungalow. This dish soon came to be known as Dak Bungalow Curry. Even today, many restaurants in Kolkata feature this iconic Dak Bungalow chicken curry on their menu. Many Indian dishes have undergone significant revamping since then. Fancy vegetables from Europe and the New World replaced local produce, and ingredients were sourced in and out of the country, building a strong foundation for what we eat today in the 21st century. The true essence of any culture and its cuisine lies in how gracefully it evolves and adapts over time. For a country with no historical connection to chilies, it's now hard to find a recipe that does not include them. In fact, each region has its own special variety of chili with varying degrees of heat and color. This same goes for potatoes and tomatoes. Vegetables like cauliflower, cabbage, tomatoes, peppers, button mushrooms, corn, they all have become an integral part of Indian cuisine today. In India, dishes like mushroom masala and baby corn masala are popular entrees that are served with roti or naan. Interestingly, the word curry is still not commonly used on menus, although Indians often use it while describing their food to outsiders. A dish named curry is actually more popular outside India, I think. The exchange of curry was a two-way street. While the world gained a tasty new recipe, the Indian subcontinent, on the other hand, gained a variety of ingredients that inspired new curries. For example, most Indian restaurants serve aloo gobi, a hit among the vegetarians and vegan diners too. Aloo, meaning potato, came to India from South America with the Portuguese, along with European vegetables like cabbage and cauliflower. Gobi, as it's called in Hindi, comes from the Portuguese word couve. Cooked with some Indian spices, onions, and tomatoes, this dish has become a staple. Despite being around for not more than 150 years, it is inherently Indian. And that's what curry truly is. Its identity is global, while its ethnicity is Indian, perhaps because it was born, invented, or even created on the Indian subcontinent. Like a first-generation American, curry has strong roots in India but has branched out all over the world, making it a global dish. Curry has a profound impact on several cuisines worldwide. As curry traveled abroad, it transformed to fit in various cultures, giving rise to numerous variations. We are going to dive into these international curries in the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me today and listening to this episode on curries. Please leave your comments and feedback, as you know I always appreciate hearing from you. We'll join you at the next episode on international curries. Till then, stay hungry, stay curious.